Y'all, we have a special guest today. It took our people weeks to arrange the presentation. Shaun Cosby. You think he's probably president of some spy organization, but he's not. He is a financial advisor. The man works for Merrill Lynch. Is that right? That's correct, isn't it? Okay. His spouse is the best thing he ever did. Somehow, Shaun was able to convince the lovely, the talented, the brilliant, and the saintly Ashley LaDawn Lawler to marry him, and she changed her name to Ashley LaDawn Lawler Cosby. Kind of long, isn't it? All right. Her initials used to be ALL, and now they're ALLC. Okay. Shaun went to UAB, studied social and behavioral science. So watch out when you have a conversation with this guy. 15 years as a financial advisor. Hobbies, when he gets a chance to take time for a hobby: traveling, exercises, and golf. Please help me welcome a man known for the famous bumper sticker, "If you think advising people on investing money is hard, try making it." Please welcome Shaun Cosby.
All right, can everyone hear me? Thank you, Russ, for that inspiring introduction. Makes me want to be my best, right? No, thank y'all for staying this today, and I'm excited to talk to y'all a little bit about some things from our Word. You can go ahead if you want to and turn to Esther chapter 4. We'll be there in a few minutes after I go through a couple of stories. I really wrestled with what to do. I kind of prepared two different paths, one on Jonah and one on Esther. But a few weeks ago when Russ asked me to do this, I started formulating what I was going to talk about. That same week, I got an email from Bethany about doing communion, and I went ahead and used my Jonah bullet that day. So I felt like, in case y'all remembered that, I would go with the other one for this story. I want to take y'all a little bit to the city of Damascus, not though in the days of the disciples or the apostles, but today. Okay, today, what's going on over there now? Now, if you know, Damascus is in modern-day Syria, and that is just south of Turkey, just kind of north and a little bit east of Israel. And many of you know about ISIS and things. In the current war going over there, you really have three parties. Really four parties. You have the Russians, who are supporting the current dictator, and they're kind of squelch ISIS, which is involved over there, terrorizing the land, trying to take over and take that state over to run their operations out of terrorism. And then you have the Americans and our allies, who basically are supporting a rebellion, decided that it was time for them to go. Now, the issue for Samir's family and his dad is that he has a little sister who's 4. He has his mother, and then he has his 2 grandmothers that live with them. His 2 grandfathers have passed away. One of them years ago. The other was actually killed in this war earlier in the year. So his father, knowing that he's got 2 elderly ladies, his wife, another daughter, and then Samir, who's 8, decide it's time for them to make the trek and try to get to Europe to get away from this that's going on. Now, they, like a lot of folks, do not have any money, so they round up all that they have, and they leave for a path that will lead them on about a 660-mile walk to try to get to the Aegean Sea once they pass through Turkey, cross over that sea and get into Greece, and then make their way eventually, hopefully, to Germany or somewhere where they'll have hope of a better life. By the way, that's about like you and I leaving this church and walking to Chicago, trying to cross Lake Michigan and get to Canada. That's basically what they're trying to do, with very little money, very little resources. And as they head out across the upper part of Syria, they basically have to walk through a desert to try to get to the mountain range that separates Syria from Turkey. During that walk, basically, it's very high heat. There's no water. Remember the circumstances that they're traveling through. This is not a lot of 20-year-old men walking around. This is families that are making this trek with the possessions basically that they can take. They eventually cross mountains, basically somewhere the size of this mountain range, somewhere between the Appalachians and the Rockies. Not quite the Rockies, but greater than the Appalachians. So if you've ever driven from Asheville, for example, to Knoxville, it's larger than that, right, on a walk. And so they cross eventually into Turkey. At that point, they try to make their way to the edge of the Aegean, which they finally do. But as you know, and as you've heard in the news, there are a lot of folks that are making this path. And there are a lot of people that want to take advantage of the people who are making this path. And so once they reach the Aegean, the idea is they've got to find a boat to cross that sea. So you have, what's going on over there is you've got people, again, that are trying to extort these people and charge exorbitant amounts of money to make them pay for a boat to get across. So at this point, and there's a lot of them there, again, trying. So what you have is you have people blowing up rafts and all kinds of things. And remember, these people don't really and typically understand what lies ahead of them. So they don't know that much about the Aegean per se. It's not that large. It's a little bit smaller than crossing the Gulf of Mexico. Certainly not like crossing the Atlantic, but it can be particularly stormy and rocky, and it's not the place for a raft. Eventually, Samir's father takes all that they have and spends it on a raft crossing, a large raft that holds about 35 people. It's designed to hold about 35 people. They cram about 60 into this raft that is powered. They get into that raft and they start heading across the sea. Now, one thing about this crossing of the Aegean is that last year alone, 1,350 people drowned from these type of crossings, because they're going on boats that aren't really designed for this. They're also being attacked by pirates who know this is happening constantly, who are basically on sea-doos, who will come up to these rafts and take whatever money they have left. So it is an absolute nightmare for these families after all that they've been through. As they're crossing the raft, remember, this is a raft designed for 35 people. It has about 60 in it, and they eventually get to the point where the boat just can't take it anymore. And so they start throwing possessions. And so you have these families that anything they have left, it's got to go overboard. Eventually, Samir's father, as they continue to struggle and struggle and struggle, stands up, tells his wife and his mother-in-law and his 2 children he loves them, and with the blink of an eye, he jumps out of the raft along with 3 other men, trying to lighten the load of the raft. Ultimately, they make it to the Greek side of the Aegean, but at this point, they've lost their father. On this side of the Aegean, they now have to walk, hopefully up through Greece, then across through Macedonia, where hopefully they'll be welcome, because stories are now starting to come that they can no longer make their way to Europe. So at this point, they may actually walk all this way only to be sent back home. When they get to the top of Greece, after another couple 100-mile walk, so this time you basically walk to Atlanta after all this. Now at this point, they get into one of the camps to try to apply to go across, and they're delivered some awful news. At this point, Macedonia is not letting anybody else in. It is in the camp, again, they have no money. It's cold. By this time, it's gotten into late fall last year, and it starts to rain. There's not enough tents, and the family inside this, the mom, her mother-in-law in this case, and 2 little kids just sit huddled together, and they just break. They can't take it anymore. There are people from the Christian community and others that have gone over and set up refugee camps over there in the northern part of Greece to kind of deal with this. But I tell you this story this morning, not at all to be political, because this is very politicized all over the world. Y'all know this. It's basically just to ask you and me, and anytime I teach or speak or whatever, I always try to start with me, to look at the world with humanity's eyes, with Christ's eyes, right first, instead of Americans, and especially instead of a Democrat or a Republican first. It's okay to eventually get there, but we've got to look at it with God's eyes, right, as Christ's eyes, as much as we can. And when we hear these stories, 11 million people that have left are homeless. 11 million. It's easy just to brush over that. One of the things that I find with the Middle East is many of us have basically just given up on it, right? Like to go to Africa, that's a noble calling, maybe China, somewhere else. But can you imagine, God calling you to go somewhere and, the Middle East is kind of where you've been called? I mean, at that point, I think it's just a tough thing. And so, again, I tell you that story just as a thought, just to let that settle with you on seeing the world with those views first. By the way, again, there are a lot of refugee camps, and there are a lot of stories that are starting to come out of those areas where so many of these families are making it to that place. And basically, with the destruction that they've seen from the Muslim religion, they're basically, a lot of them are turning to Christianity. And so again, instead of seeing this as a political problem, maybe we see it as an opportunity, right? More and more of these people are in more Christianized areas where we can talk about Christ. And so there are a lot of missions in those areas, and I would just ask you to be conscious of that, because this is a place where people are coming, in many cases, to us. So let's talk about Esther. And again, if you would, look at Esther 4. So just want to recap the story of Esther a little bit. In case you do not know this book well, many of us have heard this story. It's a story that is taught in Sunday schools. But can anybody tell me something that Esther shares? It's unique to the book that we don't find in any other book in the Bible. Anyone know what I'm speaking of about the book of Esther? Now, I know this is a very broad question, but anyway. Yeah, it's similar to, I picked it because it's close to Easter. No. No, it's the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God, right? So it doesn't directly mention God. God, however, is written all over the book of Esther, okay? It actually takes criticism sometimes for being in the Bible for that. Now, we know about it, talks about the Jewish background. Again, in my thoughts, God is written all over this, but let's talk a little bit about what went on in the book of Esther. So just to kind of go back through history, many of us are familiar with King David, right, who had King Solomon. Now, Solomon had two sons that wanted to inherit the kingdom that couldn't agree, so Jeroboam and Rehoboam took the kingdom, the united kingdom, if you will, of Israel, and they split it into two parts. And so you had Judah in the south, and you had the rest of Israel in the north. Eventually, the northern kingdom was attacked so much by the Assyrians that they kind of merged into that society. Okay, so the Assyrians were basically the big bad empire at that time. By the way, their capital, if you will, was Nineveh, right? So when you read about the book of Jonah, that's the Assyrians. It's also, they eventually intermingled, and those people who ended up being Samaritans, which is the lady at the well years and years later, right? So just kind of their story. Now, the southern kingdom, Jerusalem, survived that, right? Judah survived that particular, and later they were captured by the Babylonians and taken to Babylon, okay? Now, eventually, King Nebuchadnezzar was taken over by a bigger, badder empire, so one fish, bigger fish. Persia comes along with King Xerxes and takes out the Babylonians, which at that time was the largest kingdom that we've ever known. Also, one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the history of, matter of fact, in chapter 1, Xerxes calls basically a celebration for everyone to celebrate his accomplishments, and literally there were gold couches, right, that people were sitting on. And so this can be found not only in the Bible, but of course other references in history. You can Google it, but it's fascinating the wealth that was there. So Xerxes calls this celebration, and his wife, Vashti, decides not to come. So the queen, for whatever reason, says, I'm not going. And so his royal, the folks with him decide that, let's not, it would be too tough to kill her, but basically we're just going to banish her, right? She's going to lose that, and so we need you to search for a new queen. Well, it just so happens that a guy named Mordecai lives, again, part of the Jews that are over there in this captivity, and he has a niece that he basically raised because her parents passed away years ago. Her name is Esther. And she's very beautiful, and basically there's going to be a beauty pageant, if you will, to see who becomes the next queen. And so with her being very beautiful, people kind of pointed to her, and she was one of the ones that was taken in. Now, kind of interesting, when you read through this, you'll find that one of the requirements for all these people before they went and met King Xerxes to see if he is who they wanted to, if they are who he wanted to choose to be queen, is that they have 1 year of, and so Esther ends up being a book about her bravery and the other things that are going on. It's also interesting that when Mordecai comes to her, and she's the queen, right? But in those days, being a female was very different. You didn't just walk up to the king, particularly even if you were the queen, and ask him for something. And so she literally risked her life to do that. And her uncle Mordecai pointed out, well, maybe the only reason you're queen in the first place is for such a time as this. And so as we think about the takeaways from the book of Esther and then going back to the story, which at this point may be hard for you to make the connection, I just want to ask a few things about that. First of all, do any of you feel like you are where you are because it just so happened that way, right? I don't know if you know this, but 80% of the world is in poverty. They live on less than $10 a day in their local currency. 50% of the world, by the way, lives on less than $2.50 a day in their local currency, okay? So if you and I are standing in a line of 100 people, we're close to the front, whether we feel like we should be close to the front or not, when you really look at the world. Again, the question is, why did God put me close to the front of the line? Because I didn't control where I was born, right? I was born in Amory Hospital over in Amory, Mississippi. That's where I came into this world. I had no choice in that, no choice at all. The only reason that my house wasn't bombed last night or yours is by the grace of God. Let's just be honest about where we live. And so at the end of the day, why are you where you are? I want to take you through the Esther story real quick. You know, there's a lot of people that say it just so happened that it worked out this way. And so I ask you, did it just so happen that Esther's parents passed away and that Mordecai, her uncle, took her in? Did it just so happen that Mordecai was a commander in the military? Did it just so happen that Mordecai uncovered a plot that would be critical down the road, that would give him good favor down the road with the king? Did it just so happen that Xerxes all of a sudden one day decided to call this massive party? And did it just so happen that Queen Vashti decided, I don't really feel like going tonight, right? And then Xerxes, of course, had to decide to get rid of her. And instead of what was common in the day, to basically look to his current concubines, he decided not to do that, but to go to the current, at the time, basically to have this beauty pageant among the entire kingdom of Persia to select a new queen. Did it just so happen that Esther was the most beautiful girl in the land and that she embraced it and that she used it? Did it just so happen that Mordecai was eventually able to get back and make a connection with Esther and that she happened to be brave? Remember, he appealed to her in the fourth chapter of Esther that perhaps God has put you here, or he doesn't actually use the word God, because God, again, isn't specifically mentioned, but perhaps it is a time like this that you've been put in this position. And then it just so happened that one night the king couldn't sleep. And so he went to the archives, right? Today we would watch TV, maybe get on our phone. The king decides to go to his archives and pull up some last memories. He pulls the one about Mordecai years ago uncovering this plot. And so it's fresh on his mind the next day when there's this issue with Haman. And so again, a lot of just so happens. And so I appeal to you that in our lives, it's not just so happened, but I think as Americans, where we live today, sometimes isolated, we have to think, have we let our comfort become more important than the Great Commission? We've got to view the world with Christ-like eyes. And again, it's only by the grace of God sometimes that we're in the situation that you're in. So today as we close, I just want to ask you to think about, again, what has just so happened in your life? And what position have you come to, wherever you are, for just a time as this? What's going on in 2018? Right? What's right for you? It may not be to go to Syria. I'm certainly not up here begging people to go. I'm not telling you that if there was a chance to go today, I'd be the first one in line either. Again, this is for me. It's not just for you. But what is God asking of us in this time that we live in? And why are we here? Why are we at Homewood? Why were we born where we were born, have taken the path we've taken? There's got to be something bigger than just taking care of ourselves and being comforted the remainder of our lives. Remember, we're in front of the line. What are we going to do about it? And what's he calling us to do? So I think all of us can go through the story that it just so happened that you passed this test, that this job said no, that this job said yes, that this girl said yes, all these things, and we are where we are. So again, just think about that. And I thank y'all for your time today and really appreciate it. And I hope this message spoke to you a little bit this morning. Thanks.